Hello everybody, my name is Matthew and I learned a little bit more about psychology this week in class and I would like to pass on some of that information to you if I can. Outside today it's about 30 degrees, there's not a cloud in the sky, it's just the big beautiful blue sky with lots of sunshine shining all over the place. In other words, it's a great day to learn more introductory psychology. In this video today, we're going to be going over a couple chapters that talk about learning and memory. And whenever we introduce these concepts, it's always best to start by defining what exactly they are. And we learned that learning is really just a relatively permanent change in an organism's behavior as a result from experience or from practice. And that's a pretty vague definition. I think it'll be much easier understood when we go over different examples, talk about the different mechanics and different types of learning. And we'll start with classical conditioning. Okay, so on my board here I have classical conditioning and then two additional terms that are going to be good to know, conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus. We'll talk about these in a minute, but first let's just go over classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is essentially just when an organism learns to associate one event with another. Now, if you have any experience with psychology, you've probably heard of the Pavlov's dogs experiment when learning about classical conditioning. There was a scientist named Ivan Pavlov who, before feeding a bunch of dogs, would ring a bell. And normally when the dogs would eat, they would salivate when they would see the food. But after he started ringing the bell before giving the dogs food, the dogs over time learned to associate, through classical conditioning, the sound of the bell with the arrival of food. So when he would ring the bell, the dogs would start salivating before they even got the food. This is the textbook example of classical conditioning. Now when we look at these other terms to learn, conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus, they apply very easily to this example here. The unconditioned stimulus, in this case, is the food that the dogs would salivate over. They didn't have to be conditioned or trained in any way to learn to salivate when the food arrived. They just naturally did that anyways. Now the conditioned stimulus is the sound of the bell, because over time the dogs were conditioned to associate the sound of the bell with food, which would cause them to salivate. Under normal circumstances, a dog would not be salivating just when they hear a bell, because that doesn't mean anything to them. But if you use something like classical conditioning, you can kind of train the dog to associate that bell with the sound of food, making the bell a conditioned stimulus. Okay, so classical conditioning is when an organism learns to associate one event with another. The next type of conditioning we learned about is operant conditioning. This is when an organism learns to engage in a voluntary behavior because that behavior gets reinforced. Now, reinforcement is a key term that you're going to need to know here. It is essentially just a reward for engaging in a type of behavior. Now, the go-to example for operant conditioning was conducted by a scientist by the name of B.F. Skinner. And he took a bunch of rats and put them in little boxes. And in each of these boxes there was one rat and a lever. And either through curiosity or by accident, the rat would eventually push the lever as it was wandering around in the box. And whenever it would push the lever, a piece of food would slide down a chute into the box and the rat would eat the food. Well, over time, the rat figured out that if it pushes this lever, that's what's making the food come into the box. And so this is an example of operant conditioning because it's a voluntary behavior, pushing on that lever to get the food out, and engaged in that behavior to get the food as a reinforcement. Okay, so when we were talking about operant conditioning, we learned a very important term called reinforcement, which is the reward for engaging in a voluntary behavior. Now let's look at the flip side of reinforcement, punishment. Now, punishment is really just an introduction of an adverse event to discourage a behavior. And I know that's a very textbooky definition to describe what punishment is, So let's just look at the two different kinds and maybe we'll understand it a little bit better. There's positive punishment and negative punishment. So positive punishment is when you introduce an undesirable event. You introduce something that an organism doesn't like to discourage a type of behavior. Let's say I'm hanging out at your house too long and you want me to leave. You want my behavior of sticking around to change. You want me to go. So you can introduce a bat into the room and I'm going to get the hell out of your house pretty fast because you're introducing something that I don't like and that's going to discourage the behavior of me sticking around for too long. Now, negative punishment, on the other hand, is taking away something desirable to discourage a behavior. An easy example for this one is if a child is doing something bad, like, I don't have children, so I guess I don't really know what they would do. They're throwing food at you or something, and you don't want your child to throw food at you anymore. You can say you're grounded from watching TV for the rest of the day. Now, if this child really likes TV, this is going to be a good negative punishment because you're taking away, you're subtracting something that the child really likes, and that's going to discourage them from throwing food at you again in the future. So there's just a couple more different ways to learn that we talked about. Up next is observational learning, and this is essentially just learning a different behavior through watching somebody else rather than through your own direct experiences. So an example of this would be, you watch me make some delicious borscht later tonight, and I'm grating the beets and I'm cutting up the potatoes and adding the dill and vinegar and all this other stuff. And then when you make it into the kitchen later on your own, and you want to make borscht, you more or less have an idea of how to do it because you were observing me earlier. Even though you weren't directly making it yourself the first time, you were just watching. Another term that gets thrown around a lot with observational learning is modeling. It essentially means the same thing. A model is just an organism that somebody else is watching and learning to imitate. In the example I gave with the borscht, I would be the model and you were just observing me. And modeling is just the act of imitating the model's behavior. These two are essentially the same thing here. Now, the last term we learned about in this chapter about learning is shaping. Shaping is the act of continuously giving out little reinforcements or rewards as somebody gets closer and closer to achieving a complex behavior. So for example, if you want somebody to learn how to play guitar, you can give them a reinforcement or reward when they first learn how to hold the guitar the right way. You can give them more rewards when they learn how to play the first couple notes, and so on until they eventually learn how to play the whole song. Now, all these different steps that you give them rewards for, these are called successive approximations. And the idea behind rewarding these successive approximations is that over time, the student will become encouraged to keep going until they eventually learn this behavior and get a big old reward at the end. Well, that's all we needed to know about learning in class, so we'll move on to Chapter 6 now and talk a little bit about memory. Now, memory can be broken down into 3 different steps, which I have listed out here: encoding, storage, and retrieval. These are essentially just taking in information, storing it into our brains, then being able to pull it out later when needed. All these different steps are all what make up memory. Now, encoding is the first step. It's when we take in the information and convert it into little neural codes. And in introductory psychology terms, this is basically just little electrical charges, little discharges that come from the neurons in our brain. And these little charges eventually make its way to our hippocampus, where they get stored in the second phase, the storage phase. And there are things that you can do to make your storage stronger and more sound. Taking notes is a great way to boost your storage abilities. Repetition, going over things multiple times, that's a way you can increase your storage abilities as well. And then eventually, when we need to take that information back out, that's known as retrieval. It's when we're going into our hippocampus, pulling out these things in storage, and bringing them back into the forefront of our minds, into our consciousness to then use in whatever situation we're in. Now, another term that we learned about with regards to memory is what's known as the sensory registry. This is basically just taking in information through our nervous system with the help of our sensory receptors. It's kind of just being aware of something. Me waving my hand, lifting up this marker, clapping a couple times. These are all things that you recognize through your nervous system and it gets sent up into your brain. But unless you go through the process of storing it into your memory, you're probably going to forget about what I just did by the end of this video. But it is really just the first step to remembering anything, because it's just making you aware of what you are experiencing. Okay, up next is short-term memory, also known as working memory. This is the concept where if you take in something through your nervous system with just a little bit of focus, you can retain that information for up to a minute or two without much effort. So if I'm holding up 2 fingers here, you focus on it for just a moment. When I put my hand down, after a minute or two, the idea is you would still be able to remember how many fingers I was holding up after just that minute or two. That's what short-term memory is. Now, an interesting thing about short-term memory is it becomes easier to retain information if you're able to verbalize it in a way that makes sense. You may be wondering what I have written underneath short-term memory here. You can see the first line is THUNSTOFAM, and on the bottom here it's TXBLDNFGH. Now you can look at both of these and look at this first line and say that this kind of spells out thunstofam. It's not a real word, but it's something that you're kind of able to verbalize as a sort of fake word. You're not able to do that with this line here. If you did, it would maybe be something like tixbuldnfguch, which is much harder to remember than thunstofam. The idea here is you're just able to verbalize it in a way that gives it a little bit more meaning. So after a minute or two, see which one of these you remember, thunstofam or TXBLDNFGH. We'll talk now about a couple different ways that can help with memory, and we'll start with the concept of rehearsal, which is essentially just repetition. It's going over the information over and over to help store it in your brain a little bit stronger. Now there's an additional type of rehearsal called elaborative rehearsal, which is when you're going over the information that you're trying to retain. You attach kind of an additional meaning to it. You make it mean something a little bit more. And when you do that, when you tie it with something else, it makes it easier to remember. So if we think of the example of me holding up 2 fingers, you can rehearse it and say 2, 2, 2 over and over to remember how many fingers I'm holding up. Or you can use the process of elaborative rehearsal, which is, you could think, well, Matthew is a peace-loving creature. He held up a peace sign. A peace sign is 2 fingers, so Matthew is holding up 2 fingers. Both of these ways are little things you can do to help you remember something. Another way we learn to help remember things is the concept of chunking. This is essentially taking a large string of information that you're trying to remember and breaking it down into smaller bits or chunks, which make it easier to remember. Phone numbers are a great example of this. Let's say you've never heard the hit song 867-5309 by Tommy Two-Tone. If you look at the phone number and its completion here, I used the Detroit area code by the way, 313-867-5309. That can be kind of daunting, kind of intimidating, and hard to remember. But you can use chunking, where you take this number and then break it up into 313-867-5309. And the concept is essentially that it's much easier to remember a group of 3 numbers, a group of 3 numbers, and a group of 4 numbers than one long chain of 10 numbers up here. Up next is the tip of the tongue phenomenon. This is a real and measured sensation, which I thought was kind of interesting. It's theorized that we experience this tip of the tongue sensation because the information that we're trying to recall is not properly stored. Maybe if we did something like an elaborative rehearsal and gave the memory more meaning, we would have been more likely to remember it and get it off the tip of our tongue. But it's also theorized that some of the stuff that we're trying to remember but can't quite get out is more because we don't actually know, we don't actually have the answer, but we know something very similar to it, and our brain is trying to make the association, but can't quite put it all together because it doesn't really have the information that it needs. That make flashbulb memory so powerful and so ingrained in our minds is that there are a lot of high emotions associated with the event which help with the memory. People often talk about it quite a bit afterwards, and because of just how important the consequences of the event were. These 3 things all make flashbulb memories very impactful in our minds. Up next is the tip of the tongue phenomenon. This is a real and measured sensation, which I thought was kind of interesting. It's theorized that we experience this tip of the tongue sensation because the information that we're trying to recall is not properly stored. Maybe if we did something like an elaborative rehearsal and gave the memory more meaning, we would have been more likely to remember it and get it off the tip of our tongue. But it's also theorized that some of the stuff that we're trying to remember but can't quite get out is more because we don't actually know, we don't actually have the answer, but we know something very similar to it, and our brain is trying to make the association but can't quite put it all together because it doesn't really have the information that it needs. The last term that I wanted to talk about is infantile amnesia. This is why we don't remember anything when we were the age of 3 or younger. Now, Freud has some really wacky theories as to why this is the case, but the more generally accepted consensus for why infantile amnesia exists is because our brains simply weren't fully developed yet. We didn't have a fully functioning hippocampus where the process of memory storage was kind of non-existent until we got a little bit older. Well, that's about all we covered in these last 2 chapters on learning and memory. Our next chapter is going to be going over language, and I'm very excited to see how language influences psychology. But for now, I would like to take just a moment to tell you about something that I saw outside when I was in my backyard earlier this afternoon enjoying the beautiful sunshine. I saw a robin, and it was the first one I had seen since before wintertime. And I thought back to a friend that I made in East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, back in March of 2019. And she told me that when you see a robin for the first time after winter, it is a sure sign that spring is really on its way. I am looking forward to a warmer spring season and to better days ahead of us. Until next time, I'll see you around, everybody.